So what do you do and how do you judge these acts? But what is the biggest public controversy is that if you prove that this state official truly didn't care about his wife having an affair, but he cared about this person that he found out and he reported because he believed this person is the enemy of the state, this state official would get off the hook because it was a political act and therefore subject of impunity. It's a big price that you pay. What you can do instead is ask for non-legal and other legal remedies and non-legal remedies. Truth and reconciliation. If we can't punish, let's publish everything, which is different from Spanish solution. If you publish everything, the question is, you open the archives. Still, we would be very interested in reading KGB archives about some Czech and Slovak figures. Whether they really wrote a letter to invite this, the Warsaw Pact armies in 1916. But we will never learn it. No. Well, there are other rumors, especially Poland was haunted by not its secret police archives, but KGB. Who is a KGB and who is not a KGB agent? Yeah? To be or not to be a KGB agent. It's, so truth and reconciliation means let's open all archives, let's make all things public. And if you have seen the film, the German film Lives of Others, it's a beautiful film exactly about this. Even if you open the archive, you can discover that you actually was protected by a secret policeman. And that and people are fragile, and I don't know. Have you seen the film, yeah, Lives of Others? It won the Academy Award, but it's not important because, oddly enough, it was directed by a West German person, director, so a person from West who described the life in the East. And you display the truth in hope of reconciliation. You can do it, but you have to really hope for forgiving. And forgiving is a theological or moral category, and how can you achieve it? And how, really can you demand of people, of a mother who lost her son because of a bomb planted by secret policemen, can you really expect her and demand her, look, it's your civic duty, it's your duty to the new regime to forgive and reconcile. And this is the victim's voice. Victims who have some voice. It's important, but is it all? Because then the victims may say, well, it's great that now I can say what I endured and what I suffered during the past regime. But still the idea that people who committed these crimes now can run successful businesses and they don't keep their offices, but they keep their power and influence through different means, is shocking, irritating, and disgusting, and delegitimizing the new system. So it's closer to archival, historical, and I'm going to be finished in 5 minutes, I promise. But legal, if you resign to criminal, you can do rehabilitative and restitutive. So you rehabilitate victims. I was just walking past Sakharov's statue. It's no coincidence that it's in the university headquarters. And it's always the most liberal, the most radical segment of society, students. But you rehabilitate, sometimes give the property back, which is more controversial in law and economy, and of course here in the Hayek Institute and having Big Hayek watching me, I should watch out what I say, but the question is whether the economic reform, which I didn't touch today, whether you should make it part of restitutive retrospective justice, dealing with the past, does it mean that you should return the confiscated property, and to whom and under what conditions? In other words, should restitutions be natural, physical, or just financial compensation? Should it be for crimes that happen only under communism? But usually, communist regimes came to, in all Central Eastern Europe, communist regimes came to power between 47 and 49. And you shouldn't forget that there was the Second War, and confiscation of Jewish property. And clearly, if you start compensating for communist expropriations, how can you be completely quiet to the horrors that happened in some countries even by the fascist governments, like in Hungary, during the Second World War? So restitution is a big issue of dealing with the past and as restitutive justice, but to whom, in which form, and for what period are three gigantic questions. And simply, if you can't do, apart from this legal, non-legal, rehabilitative, restitutive, you also can have administrative measures. And it's interesting that the lustration law was invented 20 years ago by Czechoslovak Parliament, and lustrations, is the idea of vetting the officials. And vetting the officials means that you believe that democracy and constitutionalism, where I started today, it's not just a set of rules, it's not just a set of institutions and institutional reform, it's also about personal aspect, about people and trust. In other words, can you trust old people in the new regime? This is the French Revolution, this is where I started. And in French Revolution, you cannot trust the old people, you cannot trust the old judiciary, and that's why you end up with the new codification of the French Code Civil. You know? And judges relegated to administrators of the state. However, if you, there is a big question about, so the idea of lustration, I'll go quickly over it, we can return to it in discussion, is simply that you ban people from certain offices in new democratic regime on the basis that they held certain offices or positions in the previous regime. It's simple. However, if you're building democracy, if you're in democratic transition, it collides with the idea of democratization, because it clashes with the idea of democracy, where you simply, what is the first principle of democracy? The first principle of democracy is that all people participate in power as free citizens. And here, you classify, you take certain classifications, and certain groups are described as not fit for the job. It also clashes with the idea of the rule of law, which is based on equality of all before the law. And retrospectivity. Aren't you punishing somebody for doing things in the past? Aren't you implying retrospectively? The response to it is you can justify lustration law as an exceptional, temporary measure on the basis of what became known as the militant democracy, even. In other words, democracy is not just a plain machine of constitutional laws and voting procedures, but that you also defend certain values. And the concept of militant democracy, by the way, comes from the work of Levenstein, who, after he escaped Germany, after Hitler came to power, he said his idea, and he published the article in Harvard Law Review in 1937, and he said, we should have been much tougher on Hitler and the Nazi Party. If we banned the party, if we simply were more robust in challenging, confronting radicals who brought down to constitutional, who brought down our Weimar Republic to the end, we could still have democracy in Germany. Which sounds like a very, very powerful argument. So, protect democracy, and this is why, for instance, constitutional democracy in Germany today, they have the Widerstandsrecht, the right to resistance, that everybody who would try to bring down the constitutional democratic order of Germany may be confronted and challenged by all citizens of Germany. However, the concept of the militant democracy is very, very controversial itself, because this very concept, which was to protect democracy against Hitler, was used during McCarthyism in America. So McCarthy was fighting everybody who he suspected of communist sympathies. And it can be easily abused. So that's why lustrations was always justified as a temporary measure, exceptional measure, which can always be struck down, for instance, by Czech Constitutional Court. So the Czech Constitutional Court, 11 years ago, it ruled, yes, the period of force was still, it was extended because the law was enacted for 5 years, and then it was extended for another 5 years. After 10 years, some people filed a constitutional complaint, and the Constitutional Court ruled it's it is still constitutional, but we reserve the right to review the law anytime in the future if the conditions changed or didn't change. And but the idea of the militant democracy already assumes that you have a democratic regime and you want to protect a new emerging democratic regime against the past. And here I stop. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, and I'll collect the questions from this place here, if you have any. So, please, let's open up the discussion.
Sorry, I have several questions. I just visited the older address of this institute, so sorry.
Yeah.
But I have some questions for my own interest. It is about your book about distance of law.
Mm-hmm.
I'm particularly interested in this problem of distinction between legality and legitimacy, which I found very important, particularly in Russia nowadays. So could you just clarify what is more important in the situation of transition? Legitimacy based on popular view, because it's exactly right now, it's very important, one of the key features of protest against misuse of elections. Based on this, we need law and some kind of new legacy, new legality based on people will, not on elections which are misused. So.
Well, first of all, I should say that the book is just coming in the Belarusian translation, which is really thrills me more than any other news, and I feel extremely honored that they decided to translate the book. And of course, I wonder why exactly in Belarus. And I think it's because of this simple fact that every democratic or every political transition or change reopens the question of legality and legitimacy. And as you know, It was a big book written by Carl Schmitt in Germany 100 years ago. Legality and legitimacy. What legitimates politics? But of course, Carl Schmitt was profoundly influenced and profoundly inspired by Max Weber. And Max Weber, his theory of legitimacy or legitimation is important in one sense. He said that every power calls for its legitimacy. Every power needs to be legitimized in some or other way. Yeah. If you have a power change, which is what political transitions are about, you have a change in power, you always ask what is going to be the legitimacy basis of the new power. And what is interesting in Weber, you know that Weber, reflecting on the Bolshevik Revolution, it was already the first revolution of 1905, but then towards the end of his life he elaborated ever more on this idea of, you have legal legitimacy is rational legitimacy. But it's not just instrumental rationality, it's a value rationality. Some values are taken for granted, and they have this self-legitimacy value. Yeah, so it's the value. So what Weber asked was, what is power doing to become legitimate? And going to my book, I was asking myself this almost impossible question. If everything is decided by constitutionalism, what I was talking about earlier today was simply how every democratic transition at the same time is constitutional transition, and every democratic transition means also transitional justice. Dealing with the past is an example of transitional justice. And in this sense, I was asking myself the question, the whole transition is based on certain drive. It's not just that now we're gonna implement democratic constitutions, we will abolish the leading role of the Communist Party, we will adopt the Bills of Rights, and we will be constitutional democratic regime, and everything will be, and we will live happily ever after, because we know this is not how it works with legitimacy. So I was asking about this, what has dissent to do with it? And political dissidents actually invented a very elaborate strategy in the 1970s and 80s. And when I was mentioning Nelson Mandela as one fairy tale of from prison to the presidential palace, another would be Václav Havel. And in his power of the powerless, he drew that picture of the system which is self-perpetuating. That the communist system was not interested in a real impact. It was interested in its own language, in its own facade. So everybody stuck to the facade, and if you go on the 1st of May and you wave the victory flag, it's called now, isn't it? The Soviet flag, and if you say long live the Communist Party, everything is fine. They don't ask you anything beyond that, beyond these empty rituals. But Havel says the problem is that this is automaton. This is automatic, and this can never truly legitimize. He wasn't mentioning the iron cage of modernity that Weber was talking about, but what he actually said that you have to dismantle this empty facade. And what I liked in this strategy was not what they were fighting for, but how they were fighting. That you permanently challenge the content of legality. You're never satisfied with its law, and that's why it is legitimate. Weber was clear. He said, yes, modern societies draw on the legal legitimacy because it's legitimate because law says so. But we know that 20th century was a crime. One gigantic crime that happened through law. Let's not forget the Nuremberg laws were laws. That's why Germans invented this concept of Rechtsstaat and Unrechtsstaat. It may look like a law, but it's a gross injustice, and it cannot, no sensible person would call it law. That if you have a sexual intercourse with a person of Jewish origin, you're committing a crime. This is sickening. This is, if you have the political trials in Stalinist Russia, how come that those hardened revolutionaries rather confess to the most impossible and absurd crimes? Because they wanted to end this fair due process of law and rather die, be executed, than to sustain more of interrogation. So we know that for the 20th century taught us an important lesson. Always question what is the content of law. And it applies to totalitarian extreme regimes, but it also applies to democracy. And that's why I like the political dissent as a systemic strategy. Always question, it's not a moral position that we have morally higher ground. No, we are political citizens, we are politically active citizens because we question what law does and what is the content of law and how it works. It's almost like turning it into a sociological question, from normative question. Now we have the constitutional state, so everything is legitimate. No, if you enact laws which are emergency laws, effectively bringing some people outside the legal domain, on terrorism ground charges or whatever, well, how can you justify it? You turn the rule of law into the state of exception. And that's what but I try to theorize it a little bit more in Dissidents of Law. That's why I said, well, they are truthful to the law by turning legitimacy into a permanent process of legitimation. And you need political dissent, because if you don't have any political dissent, you can tell you don't have democratic society and free country.
And what in this case is a question, or your understanding of fiction? Fiction is a purely descriptive term, or some kind of this understanding of permanent, unstable, contingent character of these legal terms that are simply fictions. But because we have in Russian fiction, it's purely literary term. So fiction,
we lawyers, I don't know if you are a lawyer, but by training, but in law, there's plenty of fictions. Like in time, for instance, like in who is a father or a child? Yeah, there is a fiction, there are assumptions, and you can challenge it. And with DNA tests, it's now much more open. But for a very long time, so law is based on fiction, but also political fictions. I actually use in the book, I use the philosophy of Weininger, and philosophy als ob, as if philosophy. Yes, so with one of those interesting Kantian, almost forgotten figures, but very important for law. And how do we understand our political societies? Of course, on some ideas of fictions. The fiction of a social contract. We all know it's fiction, but it's so important. The idea that it's all of us coming to some form of contract. That in earlier on I used this picture of Adam Michnik shaking hands with General Kiszczak. If you shake hands, there is some element of contractuality. Yeah? I take you seriously, you take seriously, and let's. Yeah. So the idea of social contract is important fiction, which brings in freedom. You have the freedom of will to enter it, and of course, equality, because you enter it as equal. The problem of, and this is the tragedy. So it's also a legal technical term which I try to generalize and use. So through these fictions, we can always, because I use the term of in fiction, maybe I should have use the better one, because some people immediately think of infections, but this is infictions. Like fictions coming into purely legalistic world from outside. You know, like another big fiction would be like the idea of the state as a machine, which was introduced by Thomas Hobbes, a completely de-theologizing fiction of politics. Politics and theology, politics and religion have nothing to do, have nothing together. Politics should be described in its own language. Fiction of social contract, but also the state is a machine. Not interested in your internal thinking, but interested in your external behavior. Very, very important break with certain political tradition. And maybe we should fictionalize more political dissent as important element in legitimacy and legitimation of our constitutional democracies. Yeah? And yeah, so this is what I meant by the idea of a fiction. Maybe, yeah, because we always, it's generally linked to the idea of the social construction of reality. It's, what was, I mentioned liberty, equality. It's interesting that the third revolutionary ideal, that of fraternity or brotherhood, of course meaning sisterhood as well, so this fraternity, you cannot translate into politics. And the moment you translate it, you always end up in gigantic camp. Yeah? You have to, this is Rousseau, this is Robespierre, this is Lenin. You have to force people to become free. Yeah? And the idea of the proletariat dictatorship is nothing but the fiction of having fraternity introduced through the moment of political break. And of course, yeah, this is... Yeah.
Yes, I have several questions about your report. If I understand clearly, you divide different countries, different systems as more successful in transition and less successful in transition. If so, could you please give some examples of successful and unsuccessful countries? And another question, when you say law is a vehicle of transition, what do you mean by law? Do you mean it as a number of the new laws, or equality of law enforcement, or what do you mean?
Well, first of all, I didn't mention it in the beginning, but I probably should have, that there is no single model of democracy that you could measure success of democratic transition against. Yeah, it's not like the League of Champions, that some are winners, some are losers, because if you look at democracy, it's different in United States, Britain, Germany and France, and you cannot say that Britain is more democratic, for instance, than Germany. Well, I wouldn't say that. Maybe some people in the House of Lords would, but I would say, well, we appreciate you. But it's this, yeah. So there are different democratic models, but there are certain preconditions in which you need to successfully implement to have some hopes of democratic transition and building reasonably accountable constitutional democracy, which is and clearly when you compare, yes, you have democratic transitions which can go in reverse, like I didn't want to say that, but yeah, it's clearly. But of course, the problem is if you have democratization and you have complete collapse of any accountability, people will be asking questions about law and saying, well, if democracy is a complete anarchy, and I want more of security than the old system was bringing. People were asking the same questions even in Central Eastern Europe, but of course, first, what certainly was important, and 1994, so a long time ago, when I was just a starting scholar and obviously believing in this politics of transition, that it's all in political act and it's all in discontinuity, social and political discontinuities, then linking up and leading to a new model. And I met with the most distinguished sociologist of law in Britain, Roger Cottrell, who is one of the finest scholars and persons, and because he's Durkheimian, so he said, well, but Jiří, what about those undercurrents? What about those traditions? I said, oh yeah, there are some traditions, and now 20 years on, almost 20 years on, I realize how much sense there was in Roger's comment, because of course, as a good Englishman, he was very, very politely contradicting to me, and I didn't realize at the time he was contradicting, because it was so polite. But he was absolutely right in raising the problem of constitutional traditions, political traditions. Isn't it fascinating when you work in the field of corruption, for instance, that those countries almost went back to corruption traditions that were there before communism, before this discontinuity. So today you have Estonia, one of the most accountable countries in the European Union. You have Czech Republic, Poland, struggling somewhere in the lower middle sector, but actually not doing that differently from Austria, which is very successful and very corrupt society. Let's not think of Austria. I think Hayek would agree that today Austria is politically one of shameful cases in Europe, but economically is doing, yeah, and so these are different issues. So what I wanted to say is that even these traditions, corruption patterns re-emerged, and you shouldn't underestimate the role of constitutional and political patterns. There's no coincidence that, for instance, Czech Republic ended up in the parliamentary regime with strong elements of president as informal authority in constitutions. Constitutional conventions playing into the hand of a stronger president like in the First Republic. So the First Republic was very important. So for this, and you had democratic transition influenced by these long-term traditions. However, the success of democratic transitions can be measured, at least in terms of when is democratic transition successful? When old people and representatives of the old regime cannot take our power back. And in this sense, most regimes, or certainly Central Eastern Europe, is an example of successful transition. But of course, who are these people now? These people from the old regimes, where are they now? And you realize that, for instance, it's fine moment in the history of post-1989 history of Czech Republic that social democracy emerged from dissident movement. So they were like people from exile, political dissidents, plus some people from the grey zone, yeah, not dissidents, but all parties from the right to the left have their communists. So Communist Party, there was, and clearly a drawback is that Czech Republic has the neo-Stalinist anti-regime Communist Party that still can attract up to 15% of vote. It was even more now, but because people are disenchanted and protesting more, so, but it's a protest party. So if you have one minimum condition is that old people cannot turn the clock back and reinstate the old regime and its roots. Egypt would be a fascinating example of what's happening there now. A year ago, we naive liberals in the West believed students are bringing democracy to the Middle East, and but everybody was saying, well, calm down, because students are not the voice of Egyptian society, and the voice of the people may be very different. No, and you don't have to listen to Russian news, which is this English language official broadcasting, to realize that maybe in Syria people fear Assad, but people fear the idea of democracy as well. Yeah. So, can you do any democratic changes there? People like George Bush believe that you can sort out Middle East by bringing democracy in on the barrel of a gun. Well, we know the consequences. Yeah. He has to deal with pro-Iran Iraq. Yeah, no. Or not he, but successors.
I'm very thankful to you for your presentation. It was very interesting, but I must admit that I was a little bit frustrated because I wasn't able to catch what exactly you mean and resonate as a democracy. It seems to me that where we try to merge into this concept too many things. As you say, that democracy is at the same time rule of law and constitutionalism. It seems for me to be too much, because rule of law is a very broad concept that you have very different understanding of let's recall the discussion between Hartmann and Fuller or where. And what's constitutionalism? What's constitution? First, we say it's like a moral fabric of political society. It's just something quite fully disguised for Sévigné and this historical school. It's one concept. Another concept of constitution is a very formal concept, like for Kelsen, the first empowerment. Well, it's a totally different understanding of constitution. And if you merge two such ambiguous things into concept of democracy, you have very unstable ground for defining what is exactly the object of your presentation, of what you are speaking about as democratization, transition to democracy, etc. At least you see there can be two, in my opinion, there can be two different dimensions. The first dimension is pure normative, where democracy is something where people decide things themselves, and no matter who are the people. There can be only white people, like in the United States in the 19th century or in South Africa. Well, it can be other distinction, and it's not substantial. And another understanding, another dimension of democracy is factor or substantial dimension when you take some values, some principle, normative values which govern the life of the people in this interpreted society. So I guess that we must make some theoretical distinction between different things in democracy. And when you speak about transition to democracy, I want really to understand what do you mean by democracy. It's democracy as a rule of law. Well, if it is a normative concept, well, we have democracy in Russia because we have a very good constitution, and if you recall the constitution of Stalin, 1936.
Oh yes,
it was the most beautiful constitution of the world.
Paradise on earth.
Yes, yes. So
it's
one thing. And if we go to this kind of democracy, it's one thing. If you say about, if you are speaking about something more substantial, then we must be clear. What is it? In my understanding, in my opinion, what you have described as democracy, it's just a political idea of the contemporary Western societies, nothing more. Because it's only substantial. It has no normative value. It doesn't set forward any strict norms, any strict dimension to what we must stick to, what we must stick to in our legal system. So
that's of course I didn't want to use my time fully to engage in different definitions of democracy, and if you go into political science or constitutional theory, definitions of democracy, you can encounter hundreds of definitions. So for me, the working definition for this lecture is very simple, that's why I mentioned the problem of normative meaning and descriptive meaning of democracy in the very beginning. However, for the purpose of my presentation, you can define democracy in two simple steps. First, it's that people decide by general vote on who's going to govern. So it's the formation of government on the principle of equal universal vote. And second, it's democratic, it's only society in which people can freely deliberate and campaign and form political organizations to participate and influence this electoral process. Yeah. So it's easy, and then because then democracy is a vehicle of is a procedural instrument of delivering power solution for modern society, and at the same time, this definition is it sets preconditions which must be legally defined, if you ask, which means that only people who have freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and active and passive legitimacy, actively can vote and be elected, can form a democratic polity. Yeah? So in this sense, every democracy must come as some form of constitutional democracy, because you have to enshrine these preconditions in a constitutional document. So this is the minimum precondition, and it would be almost a legalistic definition. You can define it in Kelson's way. Yeah, that it's. Because we know that Kelsen divided politics, the realm of politics and the realm of law very strictly, but at the same time he was very well aware in that lecture, in that article on the form and substance of democracy. He was referring to democracy as a process, but also dividing it from. So yeah, this is the electoral process in which the constituting power of the people constitute their government. But at the same time, you cannot. You have this substantive concept of who is the people, and it's a permanent question of who counts as the people. And that's why, since you mentioned the United States, it's fascinating that the struggle for, and the civil war and the struggle for the rights and then desegregation, it comes with the increasing power of the state. And if you call your state democratic state, how can you, if you have the weak government, you can tolerate slavery, because you have a loose government. But the moment government tries to get more power, of course, it has to interfere with this business of the states. So that's why confederation was meaning, well, we are fighting for our rights, not for keeping slaves, but simply for keeping our rights of the states against the strong federal government. And if you look at, again, you can have sociological answer to the desegregation rights and the Warren Court and the whole rights movement is simply, if the power becomes now the superpower, and and we live in the post 1945 society, you cannot justify segregation when the world is divided into two camps and you play the card of the free and democratic world.
Can I just this remark? Well,